Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Kamish Orr, and today I'm continuing a series. It's been a little while where I analyze some of the play by play data from the 2022 Major League Baseball season to determine what happens during different ground out situations. What do the runners do? What do the fielders do? Where do they throw? Who's out? Who's safe? That kind of thing. And I've done runner on first, I've done runner on first and second, I've done bunts, I've done sack flies. And today we're going to do bases loaded. So we're going to be taking a look at the data, as I said, from the 2022 season, the play-by-play data, analyzing that to figure out what happens when the bases are loaded, what happens when a ground ball is hit in the infield to the runners, and where do the fielders throw and what plays are made. All right, so here we have taken a look at the data. I've broken this down by the number of outs because with the bases loaded, the number of outs definitely makes a difference. With no outs, obviously, even a double play isn't going to get you out of the inning. So I thought maybe there'd be a difference between no outs and one out even, because with one out, if you complete the double play, you're out of the inning with no runs scored. So what I have here is a breakdown based on the position that fielded the ball, and what the result was. And the main results that I look at are either double plays, force out at second, force out at third, which are pretty rare, force out at home, and then the batter being thrown out. So we'll see the total number of outs. And then I also looked at how many times did the runner on third score during the play. So that's kind of the breakdown that I have here. As always with my caveats, I may be off a number or two because sometimes the play-by-play data, the classification of certain plays doesn't always fall into the category you expect. There's some weird plays sometimes, that kind of thing, but it should be pretty close. The other thing is I excluded any errors or any bunts, so I don't have any bunts in this data. I did do a video already about bunt data. But this video excludes bunts and excludes errors on the play. So we're looking at ground balls in the infield with the bases loaded where there weren't any errors on the play, and then what happened. So you can see raw numbers here. Not very many plays total, actually. With no outs, we see a total of 126, which isn't very much when you think of there's 180,000 plays in a baseball season, I believe, or somewhere thereabouts, give or take. So 126 isn't very much. But there aren't very many cases where you have the bases loaded and no outs, and there's a ground out in the infield. So again, this doesn't take into account singles, doubles, triples, walks, all the other stuff that can happen. This is just ground outs in the infield. And so as we can see, these are the raw numbers. So I have the raw numbers here, and then I also have, if I scroll down a little bit, I have the percentages. So if we look at balls hit back to the pitcher, for example, there were only 11 total grounders back to the pitcher, 2 of which scored. So 2 of those 11 scored. Most of the time, actually 2/3 of the time, the pitcher was doing a home to first double play on balls hit back to the pitcher with the bases loaded and no outs, which makes sense because he's the closest there to the plate to get that lead runner. So 2/3 of the time, that's what's going on. Almost 1/5 of the time, he's throwing home at least to get the lead runner. So if we look at those two combined, that's a very high percentage. Over 80% of the time that the pitcher is throwing home on a ground ball back to him with the bases loaded, which, again, makes total sense. But again, we're only talking about 11 total plays in the entire 2022 season. Catchers, there was only one play where the catcher fielded the ball, which again makes sense because the catcher's probably staying close to home plate with the bases loaded for any potential play there. First base, there were 11 balls to first base. And if we look at the percentages here, almost 30% of the time he's throwing to home. First baseman fields that ball, throws to home, and then it's thrown back to first for a double play. So, corners are probably in, maybe in those cases, or maybe the infield is in. And that's something I didn't mention. There is no way from the play-by-play data to know when the infield is in or when the corners are in, unfortunately. So there's no way to parse that out in the data, what the defensive alignment was. So we just kind of have to guess on this stuff. But my guess is if the first baseman's throwing home, it's probably a case where the first baseman was playing in, either because the corners were in or the infield was in. Again, force at home, another 18%. Force at home if it's hit to the first baseman. Kind of what we would expect. Second base, there are 36 balls hit to second base, and a third of the time, almost a third of the time, there's a double play, 4 to 6 to 3 double play. Again, probably because there's really no chance on balls hit to second, or less chance to get that lead runner at home anyway. So they're trying to get the double play to get the 2 outs and sacrificing that score to make that happen. Though over 20% of the time there was a force at home, but there's probably not enough time there to do the 4 to 2 to 3 double play. There were a couple of those cases. Just one case of that. That kind of double play, so it doesn't happen very often. Third base, 28 plays to third, and force at home about a third of the time, which we would expect. Double plays to home, are only a couple times, 3 times. So that's not too surprising. And then short, 39 plays to short. And once again, he's only thrown to home 1 time to complete a double play. He's forcing home 5 times, which is almost 13%. So not very often. So looking at when runners score, we see that a very high percentage of the time, if the ball's hit to the middle infielders, the runner on third is going to score. So 3/4 of the time when hit to second, 85% of the time when hit to short, the runner on third is scoring on the play. More surprising, when the ball's hit to first or third, first base, almost 50% of the time the runner on third is going to score. Ball hit to third base, almost 60% of the time the runner on third is scoring during the play. Overall, almost 2/3 of the time that runner on third is going to score if the ball is a grounder in the infield. So that's kind of interesting. Again, this was all with no outs. So double plays, we can imagine, are only attempted if that's really the only play they have and they don't feel like they could get that lead runner. So moving on to 1 out. If we look back, there were 126 outs with ground outs with no outs and bases loaded. And there were 330 with 1 out and the bases loaded. So again, much more often the situation happens where there's 1 out and bases loaded than no outs and bases loaded, which makes sense. And we see the breakdown here. Again, with the bases loaded, the catcher's staying close to home, so there was only 1 play where the catcher fielded the ball with the ball hit in the infield. 20 to the pitcher, 33 to first, 82 to second, 85 to third, and 109 to short. So let's take a look at those percentages. And let's really focus on the difference between the corner infielders and the middle infielders in this case. Again, a double play here with 1 out gets you out of the inning. So we can imagine that there's more double plays here than before. Total double plays with no outs was about a third of the time, a little more than a third of the time. With 1 out, that jumps up to over half the time. So over half the time there's a grounder in the infield with the bases loaded and 1 out, a double play gets completed to end the inning. Okay, now obviously it varies based on position. So a third of the balls hit to the pitcher result in a double play that gets out of the inning. First base, only 10%, a little less than 10% of balls hit to the first baseman result in a double play to get out of the inning. And then middle infielders, it's about half. It's about half to second, 2/3 to short, and a little over half to third are inning-ending double plays. And then we have times where there's a force at second. Now, these may have been cases where they were attempting the double play and they couldn't complete it, but they at least got the runner at second. So again, we can imagine that they're at least trying to get the double play here to end the inning. And so we see 30% of the time balls hit to second, and a quarter of the time balls hit to short. Only 16% on balls hit to third, which makes sense because it's it's further to go a third to a double play ball hit to the third baseman. It's further to throw to complete those. So not too surprising. There were a couple of cases where there was a force out at third, but not very many. That was only one case where they got the lead runner, or not the lead runner, but the runner at third, going to third, force out at third. Only one time, and that was a ball hit the shortstop. And then we have the cases where they got the lead runner at home. And we can see, scrolling down here, force at home, 40% of the time on balls hit to first, which again, that's not very many, 13, I believe. Balls hit to second or third, or short, middle infield, less than 5% of the time is the force at home. Because again, they're going to try to get that double play to get out of the inning, so they're not going to go to home with it in most cases. And then only 17% of the time on balls hit to third are they getting that lead runner at home. So what about scoring? Well, we can see that scoring, over half the time the ball's hit to first, that runner on third is going to score with one out. About half the time on balls hit to second, that runner on third is scoring with one out. And then a quarter of the time on balls hit to third, and almost a third of the time on balls hit to short. Overall, about a third of the time, the runner's scoring from third. That compares to 2/3 of the time with no outs. And again, a lot of that has to do with the added number of double plays to end the inning that prevent that runner on third from scoring. That doesn't happen with no outs. So an extra third of the time, the runner on third is scoring with no outs compared to one. And then, much as we would expect, when there's bases loaded and 2 outs, no sense in playing the infield in anymore in most cases. They can play straight up because any out gets them out of the inning. And the distribution here is much like it is for any time, any runner positioning, in the sense that almost never are they throwing home. It's only the pitcher, actually. There were 2 cases where the pitcher threw home to get the final out of the inning. But every other time, they're not throwing home. They're getting whatever runner is closest or whatever out is easiest. So most of the time, that's, almost 70% of the time, that's just throwing the runner out, throwing the batter out at first base. A fifth of the time, or a little over a fifth of the time, it's getting the runner at second. And again, those plays are usually made by either the shortstop or the second baseman, getting that runner at second base. I see most of the time that's the shortstop, actually. And then there were a couple of times where the third baseman takes the unassisted out at third. 30 of the 80 times, the third baseman just takes the easy out at the bag at third, rather than throwing it to first or any of the other bases to get the runner out. So these percentages here don't really change much based on the runner positioning, other than the fact that the third baseman's getting that easy out at third, for example. but that is independent of the bases being loaded. As if there were a force with runners on first and second, we'd see the same numbers, and we did when I looked at those numbers. So not really. I'm trying to think if there was anything that really surprised me, and I don't think there's really anything that surprised me in these numbers necessarily. It is interesting to note that with the bases loaded and no outs, and there's a grounder in the infield, that 2/3 of the time that runner on third is scoring. So that's kind of interesting. And again, as we would expect, it happens most frequently when the ball is hit to the middle infielders because they are either trying to complete the double play to get 2 outs in exchange for the runner, or a ball's hit and they just don't have a play at home at all. So over 3/4 of the time, when the ball's hit to a middle infielder, the runner on third is scoring, regardless of what happens on the play. And then if the runner's hit to the corner infielders, they're still scoring about half the time when the ball's hit to first and almost 60% of the time when the ball's hit to third. So the runner has a good chance of scoring from third on grounders in the infield with no outs. With 1 out, the numbers go down because of the double play. So, they go down to about 1/3 of the time instead of 2/3 of the time. And again, a majority of that reason is because of the double play. Because a double play gets you out of the inning here. So in those cases, like shortstop, 2/3 of the time, that double play is completed to get him out of the inning. And we can see the difference between the double play and the scoring. Those add up to 96%. So there are 4% of cases where the runner on third does not score and a double play isn't completed. So, 5% of the time, that's because there's still a force at home. So you add those up, and that's almost 100% there. Anyway, I think that's where I'll leave things. Nothing nothing really stands out too much from the data. It's still just interesting to note how often that runner on third scores, how often there's a double play or a force out at home, that kind of thing. The next video I'm going to take a look at runners on third or second and third. So what happens with a runner on third base and there's not a force play at home. So when does the runner score more easily? How often does the runner score in those cases? How often does the runner on third stay where he is? My guess is if it's hit to the middle infielders, the runner on third is scoring. If it's hit to the corners, he's probably more likely to hold. But we'll take a look at that in the next video, where I'll dive in to see what happens when there's not a force at home, but there's still a runner on third base. Just a little bit of a breakdown. Hopefully you found this interesting. Again, check out my other videos if you're curious of what happens when runners are on different bases. Again, I've done bunts. I've done runner on first. I've done runner on first and second. I've done sac flies. I did runner advancement on base hits in other videos. So check those out if you're curious. And I know this not everybody is interested in this data, but for those of you who are, hopefully you found it interesting. I really got into this when it comes to tabletop baseball games, playing some tabletop baseball games, and kind of using the data to judge when runners should be, what runners should be doing in different ground ball situations. So that's kind of where this all started, and I found it to be interesting. Hopefully you have too. That's where I will leave things for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments or any other situations that you'd like to see me cover in future videos, leave those down in the comments. If you like this kind of content, consider clicking the like button on the video. Consider subscribing if you want to see more of this content. I also have a Payoff Pitch Baseball League going right now using, as I said, using Payoff Pitch called Baseball Maelstrom. So you can check those videos out. I do update about once a week on that league. And you can head over to baseballmaelstrom.com if you want to follow that league at all. Thanks so much for watching. And until next time, have a great evening.